That is a modified version of the Great American Bash 1991 and 1992 theme. My name is Brian J. This is Wrestling Reanimated. A lot of people don't like the early 90s generic WCW themes. And in most cases, I'd have to agree with you. But in that case, that reminds me of like Street Fighter. And it's funny, I know a lot of their, after Flair left, a lot of their graphics for their pay-per-views, like Beach Blast and stuff, looked kind of reminiscent to like your Street Fighter and things like that. So it's kind of interesting to know that this was a generic production track that they would have used. My name is Brian J. As I mentioned, this is Wrestling Reanimated. If you want to reach the show, you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. Reach me there at bshowbrian. You can email me, bshowbrian@gmail.com. If you have ideas for the show, things we should look at, ideas for matches that never happened that you'd like to see us take a look at and see what we could do with, or some great fantasy scenarios, let me know. Even feedback, too, is more than welcome. This week, we're going to do something interesting. I was trying to have this done for Wednesday night. Unfortunately, my schedule got away from me this week. I did not get a chance to record on Tuesday. But we're talking the Great American Bash 1991. This is one of the most infamous WCW pay-per-views of all time. Probably the most infamous bash, because it just ended up being a complete mess. Now, I am going to go a little bit into the background, but I'm not going to go way too deep into it, because I don't want to take up too much of your time. And I just did a 2-hour episode on a horror movie script, and I'm kind of, my voice is fried, and it's getting late. So I really wanted to cover this because it's almost 29 years. Maybe 29 years, not this week, but next week. And I wanted to do this because obviously the NXT show, Great American Bash, and obviously Cody wanting to bring back the WCW, kind of take a delayed continuation of WCW, at least in spirit, with AEW. July 4th is coming up this week, and it just all coincides with the history of the Great American Bash. So in 1991, the Great American Bash was billed as Legend versus Legacy, Flair versus Luger. And the background to this was basically Jim Herd, who is, if you don't know who Jim Herd is, go listen to Jim Cornette's rants about the guy. I don't think there's anyone in the wrestling business who respects him. He was the head of WCW at the time, and he was throwing his weight around as far as what he wanted to see presented. And unfortunately, he didn't have a wrestling background, and he clashed with almost everybody, including Ric Flair. And he thought Flair was outdated, and he thought Flair needed to go away or needed an update. And I'll be honest, I can't say I completely disagree with him, but it's hard to say that in that company when a year or two before, the company probably wouldn't have been purchased if Flair wasn't a part of the package. Flair was the man. Flair is, many will sing his praises. It's the greatest of all time. I wouldn't argue it too hard, but I wouldn't consider him the greatest of all time, but he's definitely top 3 or 5. Definitely top 2 or 3 in my lifetime for sure. But anyway, Herd was trying to squeeze Flair out. He was trying to tell him he was outdated, needed to update his look, and it came to a head, even though Flair was scheduled to defend the WCW championship against Lex Luger, Flair quit the company. So, when Flair was on his way out, the plan was for him to drop the title to Luger at the Great American Bash on July 14th, 1991. And that was, that was the plan. That was the advertised show. And if you go to facebook.com/Wrestling Reanimated, you'll see the pay-per-view event poster, which had all of this laid out on it. Unfortunately, about 2 weeks before the show, from what I know, Ric Flair said he wasn't coming because Jim Herd said, screw it. We want to just send us the belt. There was a disagreement, for lack of a better word. Flair said, fuck it, I'm not coming. Hurt said, good, don't worry about it. Send me the belt. Flair still had a deposit owed to him from back in the days of the NWA when they made you put a deposit down on the belt. And Hurt said, no, screw it, we're not going to send you a check. And Flair kept the belt, took it to WWF with him. So Flair, the man, the world champion, leaves WCW with the NWA championship. 2 weeks before one of the flagship events for the company that in previous years had been one of the biggest shows. At times it was a tour, a Great American Bash tour, but I believe it was the first show in 1988, 86, no, maybe 86 or 87, the first pay-per-view event, maybe other than Starrcade. So it was a big deal. It would be like, in a way, it would be like the WWF let's say WWF. It'd be like the WWF in 1991 saying, all right, we're going to have Hulk Hogan, Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior versus Sergeant Slaughter, Adnan, and Mustafa. And then 2 weeks before, Hogan takes off. What the fuck are we going to do? And no, actually, it would have been like, for the championship, Hogan versus Slaughter. Hogan just doesn't show up. So this is Wrestling Reanimated. So what we do is we take a look at these cards or these angles, and we look at the things in history that happened, and we try to be as honest as we can with the situation, but we also do kind of fantasy book it a little bit. I'm not going to go through and go, well, this is what we would have done this weekend. I got to stop doing that. I explained that enough. By now you should know that we talk about the situation and we throw out some ideas. And sometimes we do fantasy book, but, not necessarily to the extent that some other people would. So, all right. So not only was Flair gone, here's the other issue with the Great American Bash. There were matches that had to be moved around because Barry Windham replaced Ric Flair at the last minute. There was also a scaffold match. I'm going to run down the card real quick. Main card only. PN News and Bobby Eaton defeated Steve Austin and Terrence Taylor in a capture the flag scaffold match in 6 minutes 19 seconds. Apparently or allegedly, there was a scaffold match between PN News, Bobby Eaton, Austin Taylor. It was supposed to be a traditional scaffold match, but they got there on the day of the show, and no one was willing to fall off the scaffold, so they just said, okay, it's a capture the flag match, which, okay. Diamond Stud defeated Tom Zank, that's Scott Hall. Ron Simmons defeated Oz, which was Kevin Nash. Ricky Morton, who had turned heel, defeated Robert Gibson. Dustin Rhodes and the Young Pistols, Tracy Smothers and Steve Armstrong, before they were the Southern Boys, deleted the Freebirds in an elimination match. Yellow Dog defeated Johnny B. Bad by disqualification. Big Josh defeated Black Blood, which Big Josh was, what's his name? Doink the Clown, Matt Bourne. I almost said Tony Bourne, that's his dad. Matt Bourne versus Black Blood was a decent gimmick. That was Billy Jack under a mask. Elegante defeated the One Man Gang. Nikita Koloff beat Sting in a Russian chain match. Lex Luger, which to me that finish baffles me. Sting versus Koloff. Koloff wins a chain match against Sting and at the Bash, which I guess if you're going to set up a babyface champion, I guess having Koloff there would be great. But they didn't do that because Lex Luger defeated Barry Windham in a steel cage for the WCW title. By defeating Barry Windham, he turned heel in the process by listening to his manager, Harley Race, and pile driving Barry Windham after the match, I believe. Then there was a second steel cage match. Rick Steiner defeated Arn Anderson and Paulie Dangerously in a handicap match. Now, there was a lot of moving parts going on right now. I see Arn Anderson and Paulie Anderson would eventually, pretty soon, team up with Larry Zbyszko to form the Enforcers. That would lead into Paul Dangerously, the Dangerous Alliance. You had Diamond Stud. So you had Scott Hall and Kevin Nash in their first runs. They were pretty green. Dusty had just come back in January as the booker from, finishing out his stint with the WWF. There was a lot of guys that no-showed. There was guys that had to be replaced at the last minute. Things had to be shuffled around. This was just a crazy card. And I'm not going to talk about the rest of the card. I'm just going to look and focus on what to do when your world champion doesn't show up. I will say this. Dusty Rhodes apparently, it was mandated that he would not appear on TV anymore. That was a Jim Herd edict. Allegedly, according to Tony Schiavone, Herd thought that Dusty should focus on booking and not be on TV. However, I think this is an emergency situation. So, you could do a lot of different things. Let's look at the guys just on this card alone. There's, Austin. He was still, early in his career. Scott Hall was green, but, he's a big guy and an impressive-looking guy, and he had some talent. Ron Simmons, for God's sakes, he would go on to be the heavyweight champion within the next year. Ricky Morton, probably one of the greatest baby faces in the history of wrestling as a heel facing Robert Gibson. So that's kind of stuck there because he was in the York Foundation. Dustin Rhodes. Yeah, I hate to say nepotism, but what better time to push Dustin? Dustin had been in the business about 5 or 6 years at this point. He'd been with his dad in the WWF. He'd feuded with the $1 Million Man. So you could go with Dustin, I guess. At least chasing a heel champion. Let's see. You got Nikita. You've got Sting. Luger's there. He would be the champion. Barry Windham. Rick Steiner was a single. Scott Steiner was injured, I believe, during that time. And Arn Anderson's there. So, at the time, they weren't going to go... And I know Jim Herd wanted Lex Luger as the champion. So, Luger's more than likely going to be the guy. And they turned him heel. Which they probably could have kept him babyface, but... I don't know. There's a lot of... Here, let me go back to the roster here. July 91. This is probably not the full roster, but I always go to Soli.org. This guy keeps great records. So Luger, Sting, Ron Simmons, Rick Steiner, Scott, he was injured, Flying Brian, Wyndham, Vader was technically there, although probably still doing Japanese stuff. Oz, Mr. Hughes, Spivey, Zbyszko, Rhodes, Koloff. Yeah, it really was a skeleton crew, but you got Slater and Murdoch. And you also have other guys that are around that aren't being used. So, I don't know, man. If I was in that position, and I'm not a booker, I'm not a wrestling person, but just having fun with it. Like, if I was in that position, if Ric Flair's not coming back, Ric Flair was, let me see, was he a babyface or a heel? But either way, you're losing Ric Flair. I would assume that you would want to do something drastic and probably something with a lot of heat to make up for that. Because the people paid to see Flair versus Wyndham, or Flair versus Luger, right? Wyndham's an ex-horseman. That makes sense. Wyndham was a former NWA champion. Now, he's far removed from being the man in 1991, but I think his last reign was like 1983. You have Sting, which I don't know why they didn't go with Sting unless he just needed some time off because he'd been the champion. But I would think, the turn of Luger heel, why not put some real heat on it? Like have Luger come out at the beginning of the show. I'd just like a Band-Aid, rip it off. Come out at the beginning of the show and maybe start turning Luger heel. and have him come out with Harley and maybe talk about, back in 1988, I was kicked out of the Horsemen. And I'm not saying you use Flair by name, but just refer to the WCW champion or NWA champion, right? Because obviously the belt's not there. And maybe have Luger not shoot, but, work a shoot. Just be like, look, 1988, I beat Ric Flair. No, 1988, I became the NWA champion. I beat the man. Somehow, and I was a former Horseman. I was kicked out of the Horsemen because the NWA champion knew that I was the guy. I was the next NWA champion. I was the man to take NWA and WCW, into the 90s and beyond. And somehow that became somebody else. And the NWA champion ended up, because of the Horsemen, right, numbers game, went back to the champ. And then I was kind of lost in the shuffle. And then again in 1990, I was the WCW champion. Last year, due to numbers and due to maneuvering, guess who had to work his way back into contention? This should be my championship. This nameplate shouldn't unscrew. It should just be the title itself, the belt, the big gold belt should be engraved Lex Luger, right? And maybe go as far as running down the former NWA champions, because Luger's going to say, I'm the total package, man. I understand we've had great champions like Dusty Rhodes or this guy or that guy, but none of them stack up to me. I am the total package. And that is what's held this company back, and maybe not the company, because you don't want to heel on the company. But, this is what has held back progress. The NWA champion has been, it's not stagnant, but, because again, you don't want to make the company look bad, but, make the case, yes, there's a tradition in the NWA. Yes, there's a tradition in WCW. But I didn't fit a certain mold, and the champions of the past don't want to move forward. The only one who really understood this was Harley Race. Right. So Harley Race, that's why he's my manager, and he stands by me. When I say this, none of the former NWA champions, as great as they were, could hold my jock. Because I'm the total package, right? And again, I'm being long-winded because I'm thinking through it on the spot, but I think there's room there, right, to get some heat. Right away, beginning of the show, and then have Luger, demanding that he's just awarded the championship. Flair, and he's not going to say Flair, but say, look, here's the ring, the cage is in the back, it's ready to be set up. I'm here, Harley's here, all contracted individuals are here, the set is here, the event is here, the fans are here. Two things aren't here: the world's champion and the world's title. That means you forfeit. So, and again, this match was just an afterthought. It was a formality because he knows that whenever he comes up against me, I'm better, I'm the total package, all that stuff. Okay, so you've got it, right? So Lex Luger runs down all the old NWA champions. He's putting himself on a pedestal as the total package, as a heel, and says, not only can no former NWA champions hold my jock, but I'm so far ahead of everybody else, no one on the roster can hold my jock. And maybe Dusty comes out. It's in, Baltimore. It's the Great American Bash. It's Dusty's creation, one of many. Let me tell you something, Lex Luger. Lex, you are indeed the total package, daddy. You are indeed the athlete of the future. But one thing you are also is out of line. The World Heavyweight Championship is not below any man. It does not belong to any one man. It belongs to the people. Something I learned a long time ago. Now, you run down me, you run down Ric Flair, you run down Jack Briscoe. And Dusty comes out and kind of makes the challenge. So maybe Luger kind of gets in his face, or maybe Harley, gets in his face, and to back them up, wow, I just had another good idea for a future pay-per-view event. So now Dusty's getting involved, and he's like, look, my in-ring days are over. I am not the Dusty Rhodes that was the 300 pounds of blue-eyed soul that captivated a nation. What I do deserve, though, is a little respect. You are the world heavyweight champion. You will defend it tonight. But don't take it for granted because blah, blah, blah. It's Dusty. He could be way more eloquent and have a much better promo than I could ever do. But yeah, I'd say maybe Luger attacks him, shoves him down. Maybe Harley gets in on it. And out comes Dustin. Dustin's young in his career still. He just was on Vince McMahon's primetime television. He wrestled the $1 Million Man in a tag match with Dusty. He was on Saturday Night's Main Event, making appearances on NBC. I mean, he was, not one of the most famous guys on the roster, but he definitely had some exposure and benefited from that. He'd been wrestling in WCW for a while. And the natural Dustin Rhodes was tailor-made for WCW, especially during that time. So maybe Dustin comes out and, kind of tries to help his dad. And as that happens, Harley and Luger attack Dustin. Now, this is quick. I'm not saying it's going to be this big 20-minute thing like you see at the beginning of Raw every week for the past 20 years. I'm saying Luger comes out to address, wants the championship, given to him as soon as possible. Dusty comes out to pretty much move him along to get him out of the ring because we have an event. You're not going to hold up this event. You can come out here later in the time, and earn and defend your title that you get because, it's technically vacant. Yeah, so maybe that, yeah. You do not just get the World Heavyweight Championship because somebody else vacates it, daddy. You must earn it. It is not a possession to be taken lightly. So he's going to make him, and before he can announce who's going to face him, Dusty gets attacked, Dustin gets attacked, and I would have maybe Luger stretcher Dustin out, put him in the rack, really hurt him. Maybe Harley hits a headbutt or a pile driver, or Luger does a pile driver, whatever the case. I mean, really go for it. Because again, and have Dusty say, when I envisioned the Great American Bash back in 1985, I did not ever, beyond my wildest dreams, that I think that we'd be standing here in 1991 in front of 9,300 fans in Baltimore, Maryland, talking about a vacant World Heavyweight Championship, right? So put it over. It's his baby. It's this. So now he's embarrassing him, right? And he's going to hurt his son. And maybe he's racking him while Harley's holding back, or security's holding back Dusty, whatever. So he's powerless to stop it. So, I mean, you got heat. You're setting up the main event for the end of the show. It's unpredictable because it's up in the air. You haven't announced who the other challenger is going to be. And maybe they put it in Wyndham because, he had the history, and maybe Wyndham was even supposed to be next in line, because I know Wyndham has said that too, that it was his turn. I don't know if I believe that, especially in 1991. Luger makes much more sense. But you could even do a thing where Dustin's stretchered out, Dusty goes with him in storyline. So now what's going to happen? It's up to WCW to name somebody. And so maybe they haven't named someone after the first match. And then you have the announcers speculate. Maybe it's going to be this guy. And this guy gets beaten up or something, right? So maybe they say it's going to be Barry Windham. Maybe Wyndham says something. Maybe Wyndham steps up after Dusty's stretchered out and all this stuff. They go to the next match. And maybe after that, you have a backstage correspondent like Shivani or whoever's on a commentary, and they're like, what's going to happen? They're speculating. All of a sudden, Barry Windham walks up and grabs a microphone. And he talks about how he is, an NWA champion, a former NWA champion back in, 83, 84. I've been around the world. I'm one of the top wrestlers in the world. I don't feel like I've ever, reached my peak or my pinnacle yet. So if Lex Luger thinks he's just going to roll through and pick up this title, then how about accepting the challenge from, a former NWA champion? Someone who's not retired, someone who's still very much in the peak of their career. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Wyndham challenges him. And then maybe that's the guy that they find injured down the road. I don't know. And then maybe Sting does his chain match and there's no challenger listed. And they're going through the rankings and they're like, oh, Jesus, who are we going to face? So up until match time, you don't know who the champion is going to be. So maybe Koloff defeats Sting in the chain match. It was a finish where Sting went for a Stinger Splash, and you had to tag the turnbuckles. And as what's his name, Koloff had hit 3, Sting goes for a Stinger Splash and goes to dive over him, and both guys topple into the turnbuckles. Right, so Koloff wins on a technicality. So you could always, maybe Wyndham challenges. Maybe he's beat up before the match. So now you go to the main event, and Luger's standing in the ring, waiting to be presented with the belt, and all of a sudden Sting comes out. Because Sting, they'd been trying to kind of position him as the face of WCW, the heir apparent to Flair and stuff, except it was tough because Flair was still there. And I don't think anyone was ever going to become the face of WCW unless Flair did leave. So, as much as people don't like Hurd, Flair was probably their biggest asset, but he also was in a way a hindrance. He was a draw, a big draw. He was the man, but no one else was going to replace him. And as much as he was drawing, he was not going to be the guy to be the champion for the next 10 years. So anyone else like Sting or Luger or even Scott Steiner that came along at that point wasn't really going to ascend to that next level. They were just going to be another guy. So maybe Sting loses the chain match, and it was an 11-minute match, or fighting with chains. If Wyndham couldn't answer, maybe Sting hobbles out. So now, and I'd hate to see Sting lose twice in one night, but maybe that happens. Maybe Sting, that wouldn't look very good. Sting just lost a chain match. He comes out to challenge Luger. I don't know if I like that. But I'm looking at the roster, and there's a lot of other stuff you could do. I'm not saying rush Ron Simmons into that spot. Obviously, he wasn't a draw at that point. He was still working his way up. That wasn't even close to being in the works yet. The Russian chain match, you don't want to see that one canceled because it's a big draw between Sting and Nikita. Scott Steiner's hurt. But let me look at the roster here. Yeah. See, I hate to do Luger and Wyndham because they would chant, "We want Flair." People just weren't happy. Now you have 2 weeks. I'm trying to think of someone else that they could bring up at that time. And if we're talking former NWA champions, maybe you tap Terry Funk. Luger was a decent heel. He was big. Maybe Luger maybe Luger exacts his revenge by getting Wyndham in the cage, and maybe Luger has some other guys come in and they beat the shit out of Wyndham. That could be okay. Oz, Diamond Stud. Yeah, see, they were so lacking in star power at that point anyway. I would think that you're not going to get a great reaction because people paid to see Flair. And the other thing, too, is you don't want to come out and shit on Flair. Because Luger could come out, right? and say, I was ready to do business. Flair walked away, blah, blah, blah. Because we all know it's WCW. Flair's like Frosty the Snowman. He'll be back again one day. So you don't really want to go that route. And was Cactus Jack there? Because that's another thing, too. No, Cactus Jack didn't come in until September to feud with Sting. And the other thing, too, is putting it on Luger was extremely short-sighted because apparently there was an issue with his contract, and he didn't have to go to work. He had one of those Brock-like contracts back in the day, and he sat out most of 91, most of the end of 91. So he wins the title here against Wyndham, turns heel, forms a little group with Harley Race and Mr. Hughes, which this is what I'm kind of thinking of, Mr. Hughes, and then feuds with Ron Simmons after asking him to join his stable as a chauffeur, and has a match with him at Halloween Havoc, 2 out of 3 falls. Luger wins. And then Luger held the championship. He sat out most of the end of 91 as the WCW champion. Because what was the Starrcade main event that year? Okay, so looking at some things, this is the Battle Bowl, which is why Luger was able to sit out. Luger vacated the U.S. title. Sting ended up winning it, and then Sting would be gunning for the world title. So then why put the world title on Luger anyway if he had only sporadic dates left at the end of the year? Sting was going to win the U.S. title anyway. He didn't have it. Luger didn't even wrestle at Starrcade that year. He wrestled in Japan at the Super Show, and then he wrestled Sting for the title and lost at Super Brawl 2. So, if I'm a betting man, I'd probably just would have either canceled the chain match between Koloff and Sting, or I'd have had, I don't know, maybe Lex Luger turn heel. Koloff beats Sting. Okay, here we go. Koloff beats Sting in the chain match by technicality. Sting goes to face Luger. He steps up to the plate for the steel cage match. And when you think Luger's going to beat Sting because he's already wrestled this chain match, maybe Sting pulls out the win. Or maybe right before Sting pulls out the win, that's when Harley Race comes in, and that's when, Mr. Hughes comes in. And then now what you have, because what was going to happen anyway is Luger ends up sending Cactus Jack and Abdullah the Butcher after Sting, and that led to the Chamber of Horrors match and all that stuff. So instead, you could have done that. See, the other thing too is if Ron Simmons was, and again using hindsight, if you would have put him in that title match at the Great American Bash, there's no heat, there's no build up. So do you have him just beat Luger and you elevate Simmons? But are the people going to buy that? I don't necessarily think so. To be fair, Ron Simmons was a great wrestler, but I don't even know if people bought him as the NWA or WCW champion anyway. So, and it's not his fault. It was a pretty quick one little angle. He challenged Luger, and then I believe the next year against Vader. Well, there's another one. Vader was working for WCW at the time. You could have brought Vader in. And maybe Luger thought he was going to walk through, just pick up the title, and maybe Vader comes in and kills him. Again, it's a lot of haphazardness, but there's a lot you could do. I mean, you had Cactus Jack and Abdullah coming in, and if you aligned them with Luger and Mr. Hughes or whoever, I mean, that's a pretty dangerous group right there. If you have Lex Luger, like think of a War Games with those guys. Lex Luger, Cactus Jack, Abdullah the Butcher. Those are 3 guys right there who are unlike anything the WCW or NWA, top tier, the world champion. Those are styles that was never championed. I mean, you got crazy Cactus Jack. You've got the bloodthirsty Abdullah the Butcher. I could definitely see that. If I'm looking at, especially if you did something with Luger, if he was a heel, and I know I'm jumping around here, but like if Luger was a heel and shitting on the legacy of the NWA, I could definitely see Lex Luger, Cactus Jack, Abdullah the Butcher, and then maybe take in maybe a Diamond Stud with Diamond Dallas Page. Versus, or maybe, versus, let's say Dustin Rhodes, Barry Windham, Sting. There's 2 NWA champions. Now you've got a new guy, the second generation, and maybe throw in I don't know. But maybe that's how you build some young guys. Build a couple of guys up, put them in that position. I don't know, man. It's really weird. Like I figured looking at this would be a lot easier, but it really isn't. I just think I got to do a Vulcan mind wipe and just say I would probably roll with Sting and say forget even putting Barry Windham in there. I'd probably do Sting and Koloff do the chain match with the fuck finish, and then Sting, Luger thinks he's going to roll through Sting. Sting answers the call and beats Luger, who then beats down Sting. And maybe that's the heel turn. Maybe, and I know Dusty's Dusty and he booked it and he's a genius, but maybe that's what you do. Maybe Sting loses on a technicality on the chain match, goes to the steel cage, so now he's got a chain match and a steel cage match. There's no way he's going to win. Luger's kind of smiling. He's already feeling slighted because the NWA champion no-showed. This was going to be a big match. He wanted to prove he was the man. And maybe this breaks him. And they go to the cage, and there's no way Sting's going to win. And Sting wins. Then after the match, maybe Luger, maybe Race comes out and locks the cage, and you've got Luger and Mr. Hughes. And maybe, I'd hate to see Arn Anderson turn babyface. But maybe you have a baby, no, because then him and Zbyszko and Paulie and all that's kind of in the works. Forget it though. You were rewriting history. So yeah, maybe Arn Anderson turns babyface, because if Ric Flair was the biggest babyface in wrestling at that point, or in WCW, because people wanted him and couldn't get him, maybe Anderson comes out at the beginning, at first. Maybe instead of Dusty, maybe Anderson comes out to defend Flair, and he says, "Hey, look," because he was a heel, but he was in a match with Rick Steiner. So maybe Anderson comes out, and to defend Flair's honor, he says, "Hey, look, the NWA World Champion is a friend of mine. I'm not going to, whatever his business dealings are is none of my business, and it's none of your business." And maybe Luger's like, "You're not even in my league because you've never been the world champion," which would sting. So maybe you do Luger versus Arn Anderson. Or maybe he, beats up Anderson, and that's when, Dusty comes out. And then you could have, again, I'm stuck on this whole Luger versus the tradition of the NWA, because if Luger's the guy, the next guy, then great. I really don't see that, though. And I don't know why they went with Luger. Herd. Jim Herd. So, I don't know. My best bet would be Sting. Go with Sting. Luger can get heat. Maybe Luger's suspended, which would explain why he's seldom used at the end of 1991. In his absence, maybe, and there you go. You were still going to do Cactus Jack and Abdullah versus Sting anyway. And I know they were doing it so Sting had to fight to get to Luger. But maybe in this case, he sends those guys after Sting to soften him up. Because Luger's suspended because of his actions, and now these new guys come out and they say they're working for Luger. or aligned with Luger, whatever the hell. And then maybe Luger comes back, and I'd hate to do the Chamber of Horrors match with Luger involved. But, yeah, I don't know. Maybe Sting is already tied up in the Chamber of Horrors match. Or he has a title defense. And maybe this is where you do Arn Anderson versus Luger. And you get Luger goes over Anderson, and then maybe you have the match with Sting later on. But with Luger and Sting properly promoted, and maybe that's the Super Brawl hook. Is you're still going to do Luger versus Sting. You're still going to do Sting babyface. Luger is the heel. But in this case, at the steel cage match where Sting won the title, I'm trying to think, because Luger would be embarrassed. Here's a guy who just fought a chain match. Luger would probably dominate the match with Sting picking up the win. So maybe he rolls him up. Maybe this is a small package, something like that. Finds an opening and goes for it. Yeah, maybe Luger goes for the rack. Sting slips out and hits a roll up, and it's a surprise win. I don't know. And then Luger goes crazy. Yeah, that's why he gets suspended. But now you build Luke. Now after that happened, Luger could be saying, "Hey, yeah, it was a fluke. You couldn't beat me straight up. You had to hit me with a small package. It's a rookie move, all that stuff. But me and you, man. Same thing. And maybe that's the idea, as he was saying that about Flair. Flair knows man to man, he can't take me. This guy knows man to man, he can't take me. That guy knows man to man, he can't take me. So now Sting, you couldn't take me 1-on-1. And again, it's so heelish because he's completely ignoring the fact that Sting had just fought a chain match versus Nikita Koloff. Like directly before. And maybe that's how you feed into it. Maybe you have Sting and Nikita, they have the match. And Sting had beat up Koloff after the match, before walking off. So maybe instead of Sting walking off, maybe they separate Sting and Nikita. No, because they have to build the cage. They wouldn't still be out there. I was thinking if Luger came out to just accept his title because there was no challenger, and Wyndham was named, but Wyndham was jumped backstage. Whatever the case. I can't even keep my own continuity at this point. I'd have to write it down. But he's not still going to be out there if they're building the cage. I don't know. I also think, too, like, I know they were into the whole Oz thing, even though it wasn't really working out. And I know the Diamond Stud was still kind of getting built at that point. But here you have two guys, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, who were talented in their own way. Oz was green as shit at the time. Diamond Stud was pretty much ready to go, ready to pop. So maybe Luger's the total package. Diamond Stud is the Diamond Stud. Maybe that's your stable. You got Luger, you've got Diamond Stud with Page. Well, because then he'd have Harley. Yeah, so maybe that happened. Maybe Luger has done the anti-NWA thing. I don't think it would make sense for Harley to come out and stand with Luger for Luger just to turn around and kill him. Or maybe, because Luger left in 1992, maybe you try to stretch, I'm not saying you could, but maybe you try to stretch one more match out of him. Luger does comes back for the return match, loses to Sting, turns on Harley, beats the shit out of Harley, and then Harley comes back with Vader. Although I don't think you'd want Vader as a babyface, though. He was a killer. Yeah, that doesn't make much sense. Another thing you could do too is you had what's their names? I got them on the roster here. Give me a second. You got Murdoch and Dick Slater on the roster. Terry Funk is still around somewhere, although he wasn't working in WCW. Dusty respects the hell out of Funk and is the booker. So you could put together a group of cowboys, essentially. Not the Four Horsemen, but you could put together a group of guys like Dustin Rhodes, Slater, and Murdoch. And maybe that's opposition to Luger and his two thugs, whoever they are, what was it, September? We're in July. Come August or September. Oh, that was the idea. I thought of it, and then I got off track on Sting. If you are going to go with Luger, and I mentioned the Dustin Rhodes thing, maybe they do the stretcher job with Dustin. Luger goes on to face whoever in the main event, and if Luger's going to win, then maybe you do a tag team match at I'm trying to pick my dates here, because Luger was, that's the thing, I keep coming back to that. You had select dates with Luger. He sat out the end of 1991. Why would you make him the champion? But again, that's Jim Herd's WCW. The fantasy thing I was thinking was the Dustin and Dusty thing I mentioned at the top of the show. Bring Dustin and Dusty out, stretcher out Dustin, and then obviously when Dustin comes back to challenge, to challenge Lex Luger, you could also do a tag team main event at whatever pay-per-view it was. I'm trying to find the chronology, but I don't see it. Okay, so Halloween Havoc was in October. So yeah, maybe instead of Halloween Havoc, Starrcade, WCW New Japan Super Show, and then Super Brawl 2. Yeah, there were still only like 5 or 6 WCW pay-per-views at the time. So maybe instead of Ron Simmons versus, and that was a completely cold angle. Maybe you do Dustin Rhodes, because I don't think you're going to make him the world champion. He's not that seasoned yet. But you could do maybe Halloween Havoc instead of the world title defended. Maybe you've got Luger and Harley in a gimmick tag team match versus Dusty and Dustin. Have him have one last match come in, and it's not going to be the Dusty of old, but it's a tag match. And Dustin and Dusty had just done the one earlier in January with DiBiase and Virgil, so that's not going to be too off the mark. And I'm trying to think, Harley wrestled a match in like 92. Yeah, so you had a Harley race. I just had to fact check something. Harley left WWF in what? 1989? Royal Rumble 89. And then wrestled sporadically in Puerto Rico, Calgary, and the AWA. Fought Larry Zbyszko in August of 1990. Then he returned in 1990 at the Great American Bash. So this would make sense. So he fought Tommy Rich at Great American Bash 1990. He ended up injuring his shoulder in a house show match in December of 90 and ended up retiring. So he was still actively competing. So I'm not saying it was Harley Race of old. But here's Harley Race. He was, not too far removed from competition in July of 91 because he just hung it up at the end of 90. So maybe you do a one-off, or maybe that's the thing. I don't know how big a draw Harley would have been in Baltimore, but maybe that's what you do. Maybe you have, instead of Dusty coming out, maybe Luger comes out and he runs down the NWA. Harley had wrestled some matches in 90 that weren't high profile, but maybe Harley comes out and he says, and I think he wrestled Luger for the U.S. title in 1990. So maybe he comes out, and there we go. That would make sense. He's already wrestled Luger. So maybe he comes out, and at the beginning of the show, he challenges Luger. And either it's a swerve or he fights Luger at, maybe that's it. Maybe he fights Luger in the cage match. I don't know. See, that's interesting too, because Harley was Harley was a heel most of, the 80s and into the 90s. So it would be really weird to take Harley and have him, because I'm trying to think of just replacing Flair. That hit me at last minute. Like maybe if Harley got in there, he'd already fought him. He's former world champion. So maybe he steps up to defend the honor of the NWA, loses to Luger in the cage, and maybe you still do the angle with Dustin and Dusty, because, I don't know, you could probably still shoehorn both of them. Maybe he runs down the history of the NWA, he stretchers out Dustin, and then maybe Harley is there, and they're like, what are you doing here? And maybe he says, I don't like what I saw from Lex Luger. There isn't anybody in the back as tough as Harley Race. They used to call me the king. They used to call me handsome. And my voice is gone. But one thing they always called me was the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. So maybe he goes out there. So maybe that's it. Maybe he's the one who answers the call instead of Sting. Luger goes over Harley. And then in the ensuing weeks on TV, maybe Harley turns on Dustin or Dusty, or that might be muddled a little bit because you don't want to keep Dusty on TV. But maybe after stretchering out Dustin, now Harley faces Luger. And maybe Harley... Maybe he announces in the ensuing weeks that he gained that measure of respect. His eyes were opened. Maybe that was his last challenge, because holy shit, Lex Luger came out. He pointed to center field and he swung for the fences and he hit his mark. So maybe that's the angle there. Harley comes out to challenge. You have that moment to get through the Great American Bash, and after it, he joins Luger. If you can't beat him, join him. And then or Dustin would be like, I respected you. You were a man of honor and integrity and all this stuff. Even though he wasn't. He was a heel. Come on. But, yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to think also who else was going to the NWA or WCW at that time. Because I think, wasn't Rick Rude? Trying to think. Yeah, Rick Rude debuted as the Halloween Phantom. So maybe you do something like that. Because Rick Rude was a heel anyway. Because that's the other thing too, is Luger was a babyface going into the Great American Bash. I was saying don't shit on Flair because he'll eventually be coming back. If you want to go that route, you could have had Luger say what happened. Ric Flair didn't want to do business, and he walked. He didn't give me the opportunity to beat him for the title. He fucked you. Now, I'll do what I can to earn this championship and to earn your respect tonight and the right to wear the world's heavyweight title, because I don't believe that's exactly... I don't think that's how you do business or whatever. I don't think that's how you conduct yourself. And maybe you do have Harley come out, or whatever the case may be, or Arn Anderson, because maybe Arn Anderson is a heel, is pissed, and maybe Rick Steiner's like, no, because that was another big angle too. That's so tough, man. It's so hard to find the replacement, to make it make sense. But I do think you have to get a lot of heat to get the heat off of Flair. So that's why I liked the stretcher job with Dustin or Dusty. Because then, like I said, at Halloween Havoc, you could have Dusty and Dustin come back and challenge Luger. The one thing I was thinking of, too, is, Rick Rude debuted at Halloween Havoc. And I would hate to, hot potato the title, especially after... Luger essentially, Flair walking out, and now there's a sham championship match at the Great American Bash. The Halloween Phantom was Rick Rude. And he came in, and I'm trying to remember who he faced. I could check the chronology here, I guess. Halloween Havoc 1991. Oh, the Halloween Phantom defeated Tom Zank. You could probably have the Halloween Phantom challenge. No, see, because okay, so after spending a year wrestling on select shows in the Independents, as well as July '91 in All Japan, Rude returned to WCW. Returned under a mask as a Halloween Phantom in October '91. So they could have tried to pull a stopgap and bring him in. Yeah, because in November he defeated Sting for the U.S. title. So, I mean, you could... I'm trying to think what Rude would have been doing. Yeah, let's see. Select shows on the independent circuit, as well as a July '91 tour of All Japan. So he was in Japan in July. So I guess they could have reached out and tried to snare him away with some big money, and that would have been interesting too, because if that just occurred to me. If Rick Rude was a big deal in the WWF, why he didn't go to WCW right away? That baffles me. But if I'm, I don't know, if he's available, and maybe this is just hindsight, but if he's available, and he's been doing sporadic shows, and Flair is leaving, it's probably going to piss off a lot of guys if you bring in Rick Rude and have him beat the shit out of Lex Luger for the title. But yeah, the total package versus ravishing Rick Rude. Did that match ever happen? Yeah, that's a match that didn't happen because of timing. So that'd be interesting too, is if you had one of those situations where, and again, this is complete fantasy booking because he might not have even been available. He probably would have, if he had to be in Japan in July. WCW had a working arrangement with New Japan, so that's All Japan, New Japan rivalry. But if you could have made that happen, maybe they sent feelers out and said, hey, look, come in, we're going to do something big. Barry Windham shows up, and kind of like the name does read McMahon. Maybe Rick Rude shows up to take Ric Flair's spot, and that could be interesting. Maybe Rick Rude shows up. He's not a contracted WCW wrestler. How would that work? So maybe Rick Rude shows up. He's not a contracted WCW wrestler. He shows up, accepts the open challenge. No, because he would have to... See, that's the other thing, too, is they were big at that time on contention and the number 2, because that's how they justified Barry Windham as the number 2 contender. How could Rick Rude just walk in and... Yeah, that doesn't work. That doesn't make sense from it. It's fun to think about, Rick Rude coming in, Lex Luger saying, I'll face anyone from any company, and blah, blah, blah. And then Rick Rude shows up and beats him for the title in a cage match. And now you've got a guy who doesn't have let's just say he doesn't have a WCW contract holding the WCW title. That could be fun to play with. But I really think the best option would have been to go with Sting. I still stick with that. You could do Ron Simmons. You could do all sorts of stuff, and then that would also fall in line and make sense because like I said, when Cactus Jack came in, he feuded with Sting. When Abdullah the Butcher came in, same, feuded with Sting. It was at the behest of Luger to keep Sting at bay because he was a threat, and then eventually build to the match with Sting. But why not? I know, and again, I know people would say, well, because you need to and the thinking at the time was probably because you need to build to the big babyface win, and that's true. That's true. But at the same time, you're going to put it on Luger, he's not even going to work through the end of the year? I don't know, man. Yeah, so even June, Bobby Eaton, Lex Luger, Garvin, Simmons, Rick Steiner. Why not put Rick Steiner in there? Because Rick Steiner was going to face Arn Anderson that night anyway. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different avenues you could have gone. I mentioned Slater and Murdoch and doing a cowboy thing. Pillaging and all that. Vader was there. So you could have had Vader come in and, Vader in a cage versus Luger. And I know doing it as a cold match out of nowhere doesn't have a lot of tension, but you just got to give him a big match to get through it. I don't think they were going to give up on Oz, because Oz was a gimmick that I think Dusty came up with. But at that same time, there's an opportunity to take a really big dude. No, because you're not going to put him in the main event. Yeah, so I think Sting's pretty much it. Should have gone with Sting. And then that would have allowed a lot more to happen, because now you've got new challengers. You got Cactus Jack. You got Abdullah. Yeah, because let's look at August and September. Roster for August 91 was who new came in? So you got Simmons, but he's a babyface. Arn Anderson, because Arn Anderson, you could work him up and have him do some matches against the champ, Sting. Richard Morton was heel. Wyndham was still there. Vader and Sting. That's a couple years before their big feud in 92, 93. Spivey was there. Diamond Stud, fresh guy. Yeah, Oz didn't come in until... Yeah, no, he was there. So, let's see. Then for September, anybody else of note? Not really. Cactus and Abdullah. Ravishing Rick Rude in October. Steamboat came in November. Yeah. So, there's... Again, I know they were doing the best of a bad situation, but they really... Again, I think they should have gone with a lot more heat. Luger setting himself apart, instead of just a generic heel, setting himself apart as the guy, the next guy, and shitting on the NWA and the past champions. Not to say that I'm any smarter than Dusty Rhodes. By far, I'm not. Just saying. To me, the heel turn just felt flat. And I know nothing was probably going to make people happy, but, man, Barry Windham. Because I love Barry Windham, but for God's sakes, 91, rejoin the Horsemen, teamed with Anderson and Vicious. Yeah, because even Sid was gone. That would have been a big one, but I don't even think people would have accepted that either. Because that's the other thing, too, is they just named him a contender instead of making it a personal issue. Again, having Luger shit on the NWA, you have Barry Windham step up. Be like, hey, man, a former NWA champion, a Horseman. You were kicked out of the Horseman for a reason, and now you got an attitude, so let's do this. So, no, because Windham was a heel, it's a fucking mess. It was one of the most infamous pay-per-views for a reason, and if I go on any longer, I'm just going to keep rambling. So, I'm going to go with my hindsight being 2020 and say they should have just gone with Sting. My name's Brian J. That was a much more difficult episode than I thought it was going to be. It's 3 a.m. I'm exhausted. I got to get up in 3 hours for work. Share your thoughts. What the hell should they have done with the Great American Bash? Or should they have just dressed up Buddy Landel and passed him off as Ric Flair? I think that's... I think they should have just done that. They should have just sent out Buddy Landel dressed as Ric Flair. But that's it for me. I'm Brian J. This is Wrestling Reanimated.